this evening's lecture entitled Has Science Defeated God? I'm very much delighted to be able to welcome as our guest speaker tonight Professor John Lennox from Oxford University. If I were to give you a complete rundown of his academic CV, I would be here for a very long time, but I'm going to give you a few details just so you can get to know a little bit of his background. John Lennox was a scholar at Emmanuel College, Cambridge in his university days, where he was awarded an MA. His distinguished academic life thereafter has included many years teaching mathematics at Cardiff University and visiting fellowships at 2 German universities. Also the publication of dozens of mathematical papers, as well as 2 research-level texts on algebra in the Oxford Mathematical Monographs series. Currently, he is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University and a Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College in Oxford. Professor Lennox has written a number of books on the interface between science, philosophy, and theology. A number of these are available in the school library and can indeed also be ordered from the school shop if anyone is interested. I particularly recommend this one, God's Undertaker. This is my own copy. The first person that gets to me can borrow it, but if you'd like one of your own, they are easily available through the bookshop here in the school. It gives me particular pleasure to welcome Professor Lennox to Charterhouse because, in fact, he and I come from the same town in Northern Ireland. We went to the same school, although not quite at the same time. And so we were brought up actually very, very nearby each other, and it's a huge privilege and a pleasure for me to welcome him to Charterhouse tonight. So will you please give a warm Charterhouse welcome to Professor Lennox.
Very much indeed, Headmaster, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to be with you this evening. I speak to you in a way as a scientist of a sort, if you count pure mathematics as science. But I would like to relieve some of your hearts who are in the humanities division, in that I was one of those people who, perhaps like some of you, find it difficult to decide what you really are intellectually. I loved languages at school, and Latin was my chief love when I was about 13 or 14. And in the end, I wanted to do Latin and Greek and French and German, and I discovered that the school forced me to choose. And in the end, the headmaster came along and he said to me, you know, Lennox, you might get to Cambridge, but I'm afraid you'd have to do mathematics. So I gave up all my other ambitions, did mathematics, and ended up at Cambridge studying it. But that love for languages and the humanities has led to a lifelong interest in language and literature. And I suppose it's natural in a way for a mathematician, because pure mathematics, in a way, is a language. In one sense, it's probably the most accurate and refined of all languages. It's a compression of ideas into symbolic form. And going out from that kind of angle, I see that my interests have gone in one direction to the sciences like physics and astrophysics and so on, and then in another direction to language and literature and story. And I was always interested, right from the very beginning, as to where does mathematics fit into the bigger picture? What kind of ideas do I have of science, and then probing the questions that the ancient Greeks asked? What is ultimate reality? And the debate that we're going to talk about tonight really has a worldview context. And that's why it's so fascinating to think about it. You see, barreling up towards us from the ancient Greeks are 2 major worldviews. Democritus and Leucippus were brilliant. They were the atomists. They had the idea that there was basic physical stuff that was atomos. It could not be cut. And so they developed the atomic theory. They were materialists in the sense that they believed that this universe is all that exists. mass energy is all that exists, or as they put it, there were atoms in the void. And the atoms came cascading down through the void and formed galaxies, worlds, Earth, and you ultimately. There's no top-down causation. Explanation for the materialist must by definition be bottom-up. But then in the ancient world there were others, like my intellectual hero Socrates, and Plato and Aristotle, who believed, no, this universe is not all there is, there's something more, there's transcendence, there's something bigger, there are the gods, there is God. And so coming up towards us from the ancient world are these two major worldviews. Now, they're not the only worldviews, but they are dominant in this debate on the question of whether science has buried God or not. And I want to suggest to you that one of the caricatures, the ideas that we get often from people like Richard Dawkins, with whom I have debated a number of times on these issues, we get the impression that the real war is between science and religion, and science has buried God. Now, I want to say to you tonight, this might surprise you, that science has buried certain kinds of gods. Absolutely. And I'll come to that in a moment or two. But the idea is that you've got religion here and science there, and never the two can meet, and they've nothing to say to each other. And if you want to be intellectually respectable in the 21st century, you better give up on God. That's a crude way of putting it, but that's what I meet all the time from students, professors, and so on. But it can't be as simple as that. Let's take one of the major scientific projects of the 20th and the 21st centuries. That's the Human Genome Project. Now, its first director was Jim Watson, who won the Nobel Prize with Francis Crick for discovering what? DNA, the double helix structure of DNA. That's right. He is an outspoken atheist, and I've met him and discussed these things with him. That Human Genome Project was then taken over by Francis Collins, who's the current director of the National Institute of Health in the United States. He's a Christian. Now, the interesting thing about that is this. What divides these men is not their science. It's not that one is a scientist and the other is a religious fanatic. They are both scientists at the top of the tree. So what divides them? What divides them is their worldview. That is, Watson is an atheist. That's his worldview. That's how he looks at reality. And Francis Collins is a Christian. So the number one point I want to make to you tonight is this. Thinking about it has led me to the conclusion that we need to dispel our ideas that this is simply a warfare between science and religion. Now, you may immediately say, what about Galileo and what about Huxley and Wilberforce? If you want to know about them, ask me at dinner, because I'm not going to distract myself from the central issue here. All I'll say about those two iconic cases is that historians of science are virtually unanimous in that you shouldn't use either of them to develop a conflict view of science versus religion. I said a moment or two ago that science does bury certain kinds of gods, and that is part of the current confusion. Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow of Star Trek fame, Physics of Star Trek, have written a book not long ago called The Grand Design. And in that book, it's very clear that Hawking, who's just ahead of me in Cambridge and is light years ahead of me in brain power, that Hawking is offering people a choice between science and God. Now, I find alternatives very interesting. I tend to probe into them very carefully to see what's going on. And it puzzled me for a long time, why is it that Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, and Hawking now say that we've got to choose between science and God? And I used to think it was simply to do with confusion about the nature of science. But now I say it is partly to do with confusion about the nature of God. You say, what on earth could you mean by that? Well, let me try to explain it to you. It has come out in many of the discussions and debates and lectures I've held, is that people meet me, they discover I believe in God, and they say, well, you believe in a God with the gaps. That is, I can't explain it, God did it. Just like the ancient Greeks, they would say, well, they didn't know what lightning was, it disturbed them, and thunder as well. That's the voice of the gods. But then you do a bit of atmospheric physics, and you learn about electricity, discharges, capacitors, and all the rest of it, and exit God. Do you see that? So that the more science increases in knowledge, the less space there is for a God like that. Now, it is clear that science will abolish, will bury a God of the gaps. And one of the problems in the current debate is that many people think that that is what Christians, and indeed people of the two other major monotheistic faiths, actually believe. They believe in a God of the gaps. Now, of course, if that's the God you're tilting at, it is really a question of choose between science and God, actually by definition. But now comes the problem. I do not know of any serious Christian, Jew or Muslim, who believes in the God of the gaps. God is the God not of the gaps in our knowledge, but of the whole show. Let me illustrate that with Isaac Newton, who actually held the chair that Stephen Hawking held after him. When Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now I've got a law of gravitation, I don't need God. That would be a God of the gaps way of thinking. What he did was to say, well, I write this book called Principia Mathematica. You probably have it in your library. It's quite difficult to read. But never mind, it is one of the most important books in the history of science. And in it, Newton expressed the hope that it would convince the thinking person to believe that there was a God. Now look what's happening here. Newton is not saying, I have a law, I understand how it works, therefore I don't need God. He's saying, what I discovered about how it works impresses me even more with the genius of the God that did it that way. Because you see, Newton did not see God as an explanation in the same way as science is an explanation. And that brings me to another major point. One of the great confusions is about the nature of explanation. You see, we learn, and rightly so, that science has made immense progress. We've got the law of gravitation, we've got the law of relativity, we've even got the Higgs boson. I was at CERN just 2 or 3 weeks ago discussing these issues with the people that discovered the Higgs boson. At least to 99.99999, whatever it is, percent of certainty, although they're raising quite a few questions about it now. But it was fascinating to discuss with these people what they discovered. Science has been immensely successful, but Wittgenstein, the philosopher, warned people. And he once wrote, he said, the great misconception is that science actually has explained to the fullest extent. What do I mean by that? You see, Newton saw this very clearly. The law of gravity doesn't tell you what gravity is. Nobody actually knows what gravity is. Nobody knows what energy is. If you don't believe that, read Richard Feynman. Nobody knows really what time is. We can do things with all of these concepts. We have developed laws, we've developed immensely sophisticated intellectual apparatus and theoretical physics and mathematics for dealing with them. But those explanations are only explanations at a certain level. They don't tell us exactly what the things are. And that should make us a little bit more humble. But there's another element to this. You see, when Newton said, well, this is marvelous, this universe works like this points towards God, it's clear he was not seeing God as an alternative explanation to the explanation given by his physics. And that leads me to another kind of analysis of one of the major confusions. And it's a confusion, a category mistake, as the philosophers call it, between mechanism and law on the one hand and agency on the other hand. Let me put it to you this way. Suppose in front of me I had a Ford motor car engine. And I say to you, I've got two explanations of this. On the one hand, I can explain it in terms of engineering, and I can explain it in terms of physical theories and laws such as the law of internal combustion. On the other hand, I can explain it in terms of Henry Ford. So will you please choose between those two explanations? Well, it's absurd. You need both. Henry Ford, as an explanation, does not compete with the law of internal combustion and engineering as a scientific explanation because they belong to different categories. Now, I find it very interesting as I travel around that many of my professorial colleagues don't appear to be able to appreciate that difference, so that they see God and science in competition. But God and science are no more in competition than Henry Ford and internal combustion are in competition in attempting to explain a Ford motor engine. There's an explanation in terms of mechanism and law, and there's an explanation in terms of agency. So when people invoke an explanation in terms of a higher agent, they're not attempting to stop science at all. In fact, the irony of the situation today is this. I'm constantly told, you know, if you want to really be a scientist, I was told it as a student at Cambridge by a Nobel Prize winner. I'll never forget it. He called me into his room after dinner one night. I was the only student. There were 4 professors. And he said, Lennox, do you want to make a career in science? I said, yes, I do, sir. But he said, give up these Chinese notions of God. They will cripple you intellectually and they will hold you back permanently. That was encouraging, wasn't it? And I said, well, what have you got to offer me that I don't already have? And he came out with some extreme form of Bergsonian evolutionism, which is a very odd philosophy, which many of you probably have never heard of. And when I listened to him, I said, that's what I got. And I've done that. But that idea that somehow believing in God inhibits science, let's look at it historically. And as I get older, I wish I could taught history decently at school. I'm sure you have brilliant history teachers. But the importance of history cannot be overemphasized, because as you look back, you see science, modern science I'm talking about, not medieval science, modern science, mushrooming in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And historians of science have been, including some of my colleagues at Oxford, like John Headybrook and so on, have been interested in why did it happen there and why did it happen then? Why suddenly this mushrooming? I think it was Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher of science, who said, you know, in 1500, Europe, in terms of science, knew less than Aristotle in 300 or 400 BC. Yet by 1700, the Principia Mathematica had been written. 200 years of explosive rise in science when there had been virtually nothing. How do you explain that? Now here's the interesting thing. That it's variously known as Merton's thesis, as Whitehead's thesis, doesn't matter what we call it. It's the idea that the rise of modern science had something to do with Christianity. C.S. Lewis, whom I am old enough, perhaps I shouldn't tell you this, but I'm old enough to have listened to at Cambridge. I even transgressed and went to the English faculty at Cambridge when maths got boring. Not that you'd ever do that, of course. But I went over to listen to C.S. Lewis give his last series of lectures. And he's been, in one sense, an intellectual mentor to me in the humanities side. He's one of the very few humanities people that seem to be to have a profound grasp of science. He summarized it like this, responding to Alfred North Whitehead. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, that to my mind is fascinating. In other words, far from belief in God inhibiting science, it is arguably the motor that drove science. Now, a sidelight on that can be shown by the work of Joseph Needham. Joseph Needham was at Oxford, he was a chemist, but he was also a sinologist, an expert in China, and he wrote the definitive history of technology and science in China. He was also a Marxist. And for many years he tried to understand why it was that in China you did not get the development of science in the sense that we know it. Although you got technology, fireworks, printing and various things, you didn't get any kind of abstract science growing in China. And he tried for years to fit that into his Marxist convictions, and he couldn't. And in the end, he admitted that the only difference he could see between China and the West at that time is this, that the Chinese lacked the unifying concept of a single creator who governed the universe in a law-like way. And I can remember lecturing on this the first time ever such a lecture had been allowed in Siberia in 1990. I was the first person in the University of Akademgorodok, where Yeltsin got many of his experts, the first person ever to be permitted to give a lecture in public at the invitation of the rector on why I, as a mathematician, believe in a creator. And we were given a tiny corner of the library about this size to have the lecture. And 500 people turned up, and only 2,500 in the university. Most of them were professors, so I was faced with a group much bigger than this. It was terrifying. And I can remember I started the lecture, and I got to this point, you see, where I was talking about the rise of science, and there were some real heavyweight KGB professors in the front row, just like these guys here today. And they got really angry. And they got so angry. I don't like angry people in the front row, you see. So I stopped. And I said, what's wrong? So the professor in the front, he stood up and said, what's wrong? He said, this is the first time in my life I have ever heard that Newton, Kepler, Galileo, Clark, Maxwell, Babbage were believers in God. He said, I'm angry. Why didn't they tell us? I said, can't you guess? It was just fascinating, and it took a long time. I had to wait for several minutes before they calmed down, because they were stunned that that piece of information had been kept from them. I find it's been kept from many people. I find as I travel around the world, there are many people who do not realize the connection. Now you can nuance it. Loads has been written about it. I'm giving you a basic version, but I will encourage you to go away and think about it. The basic idea is there is a connection between belief in God and the rise of science. Now, interestingly enough, John Hedley Brooke, who was the first professor of science and religion in Oxford, was followed by Professor Peter Harrison. And he takes this thesis even further. And he says, he suggests that one of the additional factors that drove the rise of science was the reformers' attitude to Scripture. I found this utterly intriguing. I said, what do you mean by this? Well, he said that over the centuries, when it came to studying the Bible, people had gone over mainly to a lot of allegorical interpretation, rather than just looking at seeing what the text said, and taking it at face value and then going up the levels into metaphor and so on, rather than starting that way around. And he argues, and I understand that many of my colleagues take it very seriously, that this also was a contribution to the rise of science. And, of course, it's no accident that the University of Oxford, where I work, has got a Christian title. And I've just been travelling around the Ivy League universities in America. Every single one of them, virtually, is a Christian institution. And that, to me, is important because it gets away from this stereotype that Christianity is boring, anti-intellectual, and all the rest of it. I know at a school like this, you are taught to be skeptical. I'm very skeptical. I was talking to the founder of the Skeptics Society on Thursday night in the law debate at Oxford. He was opposing. And I said to him, Michael, I said, I get the impression you think that atheists are the only skeptics. And he said, well, aren't they? I said, no, I'm skeptical about atheism, for a start. That idea that, you know, if you study Greek, skepticism means checking things from a distance. And it's enormously important to learn to think. Now, you have heard from Simon that we both grew up at the same time in Northern Ireland and went to the same school. And you'd say, well, who are you? I mean, what a reputation your country has for Christianity. But you see, what you don't know, that my parents were Christian without being sectarian, and they taught me to think and allowed me to think. I remember my father coming to me at the age of 13. He said, "Have you ever read the Marxist Communist Manifesto?" I said, "No." But he said, "I think you'd better read it and expose yourself to that worldview." That is the kind of atmosphere I grew up in. And I'm sure that in a school like this you are taught to think. So I just want to throw tonight a few things into the pool of your thinking. And I want to probe a little bit more this business. So what have we said so far? We've said that science buries the God of the gaps. But the God that Christians believe in is not a God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole show. He's the God of the bits we understand and the bits we don't understand. And just as, I hope at least, your admiration for a Rolls-Royce engine increases the more you understand of engineering, just as I trust your capacity to admire a Picasso or a Rembrandt or any painting grows the more you understand about painting. So it is with God. It's not God opposed to science. It is that the more we understand of the universe, the more we can worship the God who did it that way. So science has contributed massively to my own attitude to God, not the opposite. Indeed, I could put it this way. I would say one of the main reasons I'm not embarrassed about being a scientist and a Christian is that arguably Christianity gave me my subject and has founded the institutions in this country that give me the freedom to think about it intelligently. That is a marvelous thing, to have that freedom. Not everybody has that freedom. Let's go on a little bit further. Let's have a look at this question of law. I got interested in this recently because when I read Stephen Hawking's book, I stumbled over a sentence. It's the heart of the book. It's the main argument. It goes like this. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. I thought, half a minute. Let me read that again. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. Contradiction number one. What is it? Because there is a law of gravity, but half a minute. Can you have a law of gravity without the existence of gravity? Well, let's be generous to Stephen Hawking and presumes he believes in the existence of gravity, because I'm not sure what a law of gravity would mean if gravity didn't exist. Okay? Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, this business about nothing is very interesting. Much ado about nothing. You see, if you are a materialist and you believe in a singularity at the hot Big Bang and there was nothing before, then you must find an explanation, bottom up, of how you get a universe and life from nothing. And I discover in reading the books that the cheating starts at this point. Because nothing, in the normal sense of the word, is the absence of anything. If I go down the street and afterwards I say to you, I met nobody, it doesn't mean I met somebody who was nobody, it means I didn't meet anybody, doesn't it? And yet, there are physicists saying, well, let me quote you Lawrence Krauss, one of the world's leading physicists, and I had an open debate with him at CERN, and I can't go into the details because I'm not allowed to, but let's just tell you a little bit about it. And he says, because something is physical, nothing must be physical. Well, that seemed to me to be the end of language. Because something is physical, nothing must be physical. Now, behind that is a tremendous drive to get a universe from absolutely nothing, but since they can't do that, they come round to redefine nothing. And the redefinition of nothing is a quantum vacuum, or something like that, which is not nothing at all. And I was very fortunate to be able, this year, to have a public discussion or debate at the Harvard-MIT Faculty Club with Alan Guth, You've probably been taught in physics about the theory of inflation, the very rapid expansion of the universe from the moment of the hot Big Bang in the first fraction of time, very small fraction of time. Well, that idea comes from Alan Guth, that we were having a very friendly discussion in front of about 150 scientists, the biggest crowd they'd ever had for a discussion like this at Harvard and MIT. And I took the opportunity, I said, Alan, I want to clear something up publicly with you. Because we're reading all these books about creating a universe from nothing, and etc., etc. What do you mean by nothing? And I went through what I've just been through with you. No, he said, it isn't nothing. It isn't nothing. There's something physical there. There is something there. I said, thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to Hawking. I hope it's not too late at night for logical analysis. Certainly, I don't believe it is at Charterhouse. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Let's have a look at the middle bit of the sentence. If I say to you, X creates Y, what does that convey to you? Well, I know what it conveys to me if you say it. It means that you're starting with X, and you're using X as an explanation for the existence of Y. Now, if I say X creates X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which is nonsense. And I was amazed, and not only was I amazed, but many philosophers around the world have been utterly amazed to find this statement, not withdrawn by the way, at the heart of Hawking's book. It is sheer nonsense, which simply proves that nonsense remains nonsense even if a brilliant scientist says it. But there's worse to come. A law can help creation. And I find that very puzzling. Because the first example Hawking given in his book of a law is the law that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But I do notice, ladies and gentlemen, that the law that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west doesn't create the sun, nor the universe. Laws are not creative. In fact, laws are not causative, are they? Newton's laws of motion, which you learn about, have never caused the billiard ball to move in the history of the universe. Have they? People accused of that. Newton's laws were described to a certain approximation of what goes on after you hit the ball, but it doesn't cause the ball to move. And this gets to an extreme. My colleague Peter Atkins at Oxford, he's professor of physical chemistry, writes brilliant books. And I said, Peter, tell me, what do you really think created the universe? And he said, mathematics. I said, oh, I'm afraid I laughed. And he said, what are you laughing at? And I said, I find that the most ridiculous statement I've heard for a long time. He said, why? Well, I said, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Did that ever put 4 quid in your pocket? Doing arithmetic doesn't create money, ladies and gentlemen, as we found out relatively recently. Isn't it an interesting thing? And you've heard the word creative accounting, haven't you? But it goes back to this kind of concept. And C.S. Lewis, of course, was on it years ago. He said you can do sums from now to eternity, but they'll never put any money in your bank. You'll have to get the money first before that you can apply the laws and the mathematical arguments towards them. And yet, you have serious people like Paul Davies in physics, Peter Atkins, and now Hawking suggesting that the universe is created by mathematics. It seems to me that is a complete confusion of categories. But now, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring it to another thing. Having got us to think a little bit about law, one of the prime objections I make, and I met it just yesterday, I was in school yesterday, by the way, in Oxford, with the sixth form, and this question came up, and it's a very logical question. It said, look, you know, you are a Christian, and one of the things about Christianity is it obliges you to believe in the miracles of Jesus. In his virgin conception, in the miracles of turning water into wine, in his resurrection. And I was in New York last month, very unexpectedly called upon at short notice to debate Dawkins again. And he brought this up, first thing on the TV show. He said, well, of course I've met John Lennox before. And John Lennox, believe it or not, sure he believes. He believes that Jesus turned water into wine. And it's almost as if, goodness me, the man has taken leave of his senses. So what I said to him and what I said last night was this: look, if Jesus was the person that the New Testament claims him to be, the Word of God incarnate, the Creator, then if you have once created water, turning it into wine may not be as big a difficulty as you conceive. But secondly, I said to Richard Dawkins, that's not where your problem lies. It doesn't actually lie at the first level with the claimed miracles of Jesus. It lies deeper in an a priori rejection of the supernatural, which goes back in most cases to the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume. Now, David Hume is a very interesting character, and I've been very interested in him for many years. And let me cut to the quick of this. He defined miracles to be violations of the laws of nature. Now, if you define a miracle to be violations of the laws of nature on one hand, and you're a scientist on the other hand, you can easily see how any self-respecting scientist is going to have massive difficulty with the concept of miracle, because look, science has given us these laws of nature, and you're coming along and saying they can be violated. That is absurd. I sympathize with that. I feel the weight of that objection. But you see, it seems to me the answer lies in investigating the claim that miracles of the kind in the New Testament, I'm going to restrict myself to those, there are many spurious claims to miracle, of course, that they do violate the laws of nature. I don't think they do at all. Let me give you a little illustration. Suppose I am staying in a hotel, and I put one night £100 into the drawer in my bed. That's usual in school when you put £100 in your drawer. Many would have £100. Put £100 in your drawer tonight, you put £100 in your drawer tomorrow night. So you've got £200. You wake up the next morning and you open the drawer and you find £50. Now, do you say the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of ignorance? Think about it. I think you laugh because you would say the laws of England have been broken. A thief has come in, but how do you know? You know because you know the laws of arithmetic. If you didn't know that 100 plus 100 was 200, but this was a sort of variable thing, and it was true on a Tuesday night but not on Thursday, you say, okay, 100 plus 100 was 200, 2 days ago, now it's 50, so what? But it's because you know the law of arithmetic that tells you that a thief has put their hand into the system. Now that is extremely important. It's a very simple analogy, but it's a very useful one. You see, the interesting thing is, and here's an answer to another objection of Hume, who said that, look, people in the New Testament times were pre-scientific, they were very primitive, they didn't know the laws of nature. Of course they believed in miracles. That's impossible for us now. That's nonsense, of course. The man that John describes in John chapter 9, who was born blind, when he got cured by Jesus, he said to the people around, he said, you know, it has never been heard from the beginning of the world to now that a man born blind got his sight. He knew the norm, that people born blind don't get their sight, so he recognized the miracle. If you didn't know the norm that dead bodies normally remain in graves, you'd never think anything special about the day that Jesus rose from the dead. You've got to know the regularity in order to recognize whether something as special has happened or not. Now, miracles would be violations of the laws of nature if Christians were claiming, for instance, that Jesus' resurrection was a result of things happening in the tomb, normal physical processes going on according to the normal laws of physics and chemistry in the tomb 5 minutes before it happened. That would then be breaking the laws of nature, but Christians don't claim that. They claim this was an intervention by God. God was feeding, so to speak, power in from outside. And it's very interesting. Let me put it this way. I believe that when Jesus turned water into wine, he did a miracle. But if you drank too much of that wine, you'd get drunk, just as with any other wine. When Joseph discovered that Mary was pregnant, and she said, well, I was visited by an angel, he said, oh yes. Oh yes, I don't believe it. And the record, the historical record, which remember comes from very conservative Jewish sources, who wouldn't be likely to talk about such things at all, the record is that he wanted to divorce her. He knew exactly where babies came from. He knew the norm. And so he rejected her. It took very powerful interventions by God to get Joseph to accept her. But now what happened? There's a miraculous conception, not a miraculous. Exactly 9 months later, as Dr. Luke, the medical doctor who writes the third gospel, points out, exactly 9 months later, a baby was born. The laws of nature take over. God feeds it you eventually. Science cannot say anything about that, as far as I can see. And therefore, it's very important that this objection that Richard Dawkins has, and many of my colleagues have, that we deal with it a priori. Because I've discovered that if you say, well, I believe in the resurrection, here's the evidence, they listen sometimes, but then they say, but look, there's no point in arguing about this, because it is impossible a priori. It is an impossibility conceptually because of Hume's definition. So I felt on that occasion with Richard Dawkins and also Christopher Hitchens, it was important to deal with that aspect of the question. So we need to see, a lot of this has been about law, hasn't it? We need to see exactly where the laws of nature belong. Science is utterly marvelous, but we do science no service if we regard it as the only way to truth. Now that brings me now to another slight variation on the thing. Scientism is remarkably common these days. That is the notion that science is the only way to truth. Bertrand Russell, who didn't espouse this view, by the way, but he put it brilliantly. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. There are many people who hold that view. Think about it for a moment, another little bit of logic. It is self-contradictory. The statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, is it a statement of science? No, it isn't. Therefore, you cannot know it. Therefore, if it's true, it's false. It goes too far. And Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, scientist at Oxford, said, it is so easy to see that science is its limits. Because science cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of life? And he added, it is through philosophy and religion and literature that you must turn for answers to those questions. And Sir Peter Medawar, he wrote a book that I would recommend that all of you who are doing science read. It's called Advice to a Young Scientist. It is very interesting. And he really stresses this, that we do science no service in exaggerating its power. You know, if science was the only way to truth, you'd have to close half the faculties of this school. And I'm not sure the headmaster or half the teachers would be very pleased about that. You'd have to shut down history, economics, philosophy, literature, language, and all the rest of it, if science is the only way to truth. But you see, you don't really believe that. You live in a bigger universe, and I'm delighted to observe that. A universe that has science in it, which is a powerful tool, but its very power depends on its having a limited range. But it has been so impressive that underneath the radar slips the fact that it's not answering the big questions at all. The questions of meaning. And I go back to Wittgenstein again, because a number of writers in the last few years have been picking up on one of the things he said, the meaning of the system is going to be found outside the system. And this brings me back to worldview, the big picture. And school is a marvelous place where you're asking your questions, you're building up your concept of what your worldview is going to be. And that's why it is so healthy to have inputs from all kinds of directions and learn to be skeptical, but not only in one direction. I meet people who are very skeptical of Christianity, but they have no skepticism at all of their own atheism. I also meet people who are very skeptical of atheism, but have no skepticism about their own faith in God. And to avoid that, I was catapulted into this when I appeared in Cambridge in my first week. And I was at dinner one night, and a student said to me, rather too loudly for my liking, he said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you're Irish. I should not have asked you that question. All you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it." Well, I'd heard that before, and Simon's heard it before. But I thought, here's my chance now. One of the things I didn't have the opportunity to do a great deal in Northern Ireland was get to know people who did not share my worldview. So I decided on that day, right, I'm going to spend my time, in fact it turned out I spent my life, getting to know and befriend people who take a diametrically opposed point of view. Because if what I believe is true, it will withstand that exposure. If what I believe isn't true, it'll be wiped out and a good thing too. That's what took me to Eastern Europe, having learned German to speak it in that context of particularly East Germany, where they'd been systematically exposed to atheism in the school system, and then to Russia, where I learned the language for translation purposes. Going in 1989 and meeting people in the Academy of Sciences who were simply amazed that it was possible to be an intellectual, as they put it, and to believe in God, facing that kind of discussion. And I found it an enormously stimulating and invigorating thing. So whatever you believe in this audience tonight, make sure you get to know the best case of your opponents. That's the important thing, the best case, not the worst case of your opponents. That's why I spend so many hours studying atheists and taking them seriously, because I actually do want to know the truth. It's a truth question for me. And that brings me to the final thing that I need to talk about tonight. Perhaps you think the last thing should be the final, but I've got a few more minutes. And you're going to get dinner, I believe. So wait and you will be rewarded. The final thing is, a lot of confusion arises out of what we mean by faith. You see, Richard Dawkins and the new atheists, as they're called, all believe that faith is a religious concept, number one, and it means believing where there isn't any evidence, number two. Now, the word faith is an interesting word. It has at least two primary meanings, which get very confused. There is an objective and a subjective side to it. The Christian faith, the Buddhist faith, the Confucian faith. That means the set of doctrines to be believed. Objective in that sense, that they're outside of you, they're written down somewhere. But then there's my faith and your faith, our personal reaction to those things. And in discussing faith, those get confused. Now, Dawkins believes, and I use him simply because he's the most articulate, that faith is therefore blind. And so when he meets me, he describes me as a man of faith. And that might seem to you to be a compliment. Actually, it's about the worst insult I can imagine. Because Lennox, there's no point in talking to him, you see, because he believes where there's no evidence. So end of story. I find that a very cheap way out of what is an almost impossible situation that has been created by redefinition of a word. The Oxford English Dictionary is holding true to the faith. Because it gives, as you look it up in your library, faith, English, comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity, conveys ideas of trust, loyalty, commitment on the basis of evidence, and so on and so forth. And every one of us in this room tonight understands that. Go back to my analogy of the banks. Some of us thought we could trust the bankers, had faith in them. And I know there are some very good bankers and some future bankers in this room, so don't take this as a general criticism at all. But people thought they could trust the bankers. They had faith, but they found it was misplaced. The system collapses, and then what happens? The market freezes because they can't get confidence back. What does that mean? They can't get a basis back in order to regain the trust. So I don't meet anybody today who doesn't understand what evidence-based trust is. And you understand it, of course, at the informal level. Because we not only speak of faith in facts, faith That is, we believe the fact that Caesar invaded Britain. We also talk about faith in people. And there are certain people you trust, and there are others you don't trust. And you know why. It's evidence-based faith. And the question is this: is Christianity, and I allow other religions, of course, to speak for themselves, I can only speak to you as a Christian, is Christianity an evidence-based faith or not? And my answer to that is a resounding yes. It's an evidence-based faith. And at St. Edward's in Oxford last night, they do a special paper on John's Gospel. They think their way through it. So I used that. And if you take the fourth Gospel, at the very end of it, John says this: Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, I've selected certain things. John calls them semeion, signs, from which we get the word semiotic. That is, things Jesus did that pointed beyond to his identity. I've chosen these to provide a basis for belief. In other words, this is the evidence to which you can respond. Blind faith is a very dangerous thing. The kind of thing that causes young men to fly planes into tall buildings. The Christian faith is not blind. Even though, very sadly, I must admit to you, there are some professing Christians that behave as if it were. In other words, I believe it's evidence-based. So that's the one half of the story. The other half is just as serious. Because the new atheists define faith to be believing without evidence, they don't realize that faith operates in their science. And I had a wonderful spat with Peter Singer. He's the world's leading bioethicist. I debated him in Melbourne last year. And I told him, quite honestly, as I told you, that my parents were Christian, so were my grandparents. And he got up and said, well, of course, that's my principal objection to religion. People usually stay in the religion, the faith in which they were brought up. So when I got a chance to speak, I said, Peter, let's square this a little bit. I think the audience would like to know about your parents. Were they atheists? He said, yes, they were. So I said, you stayed in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. I said, oh, sorry, I was under the impression you believed it. And the Twitter sphere, I believe that's what you call it, Twitter sphere, is it, became alive at that moment with philosophers saying, what is this man saying? Doesn't he realize as a philosopher that his atheism is a worldview that he believed? Apparently not. It isn't a faith. Christopher Hitchens, marvelous orator that he was, and I got on very well with him, and I'm so sad that he died. But Christopher Hitchens once wrote, he said, you know, if you've got the faith to believe something, that diminishes the probability that it's true. So I asked him publicly in the United States, did he believe in his own existence? And be careful with the answer, because if you believe in your own existence, that diminishes the probability that you exist. It has led him to say, our faith, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith. It is utter confusion, and it's slipped into it. I mentioned the OED, dare I mention Webster's Dictionary? It's even got into Webster's Dictionary. Faith now, believing where there's no evidence. So my final point then, as we round off this, faith is essential in science. And here's one of the most interesting things to me. I believe, as a scientist, that the universe is in part rationally intelligent. Otherwise, I wouldn't do science. John Polkinghorne, who taught me physics, quantum physics at Cambridge, said, physics is powerless to explain its belief in the rational intelligibility of the universe for the simple reason that you have to believe it before you do any physics at all. So why do I believe science can be done? Now, the pioneers of science, as we've seen, they started from a belief in a rationally intelligent universe because they based it on the idea that had been created and was being upheld by a rationally intelligent God. But I suppose I don't believe that. Let me wear an atheist hat for a moment. And I've been through this with many of my atheist friends. What is the thing with which I do science? It is the mind. What is the mind? Well, it is the brain, if you're a reductionist. It is the brain. What is the brain? the brain, and I'm putting it crudely and rapidly, but so you get the point. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, as the whole universe is. Oh, I say that's very interesting. Why then do you trust it? If you thought that the computer you use on your desk tomorrow was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, how far would you trust it? You wouldn't trust it at all. Now, leading philosophers, this is something, and you might want to research this, that appears in the Origin of Species. Darwin, it's called Darwin's doubt. Because he reflected on his own theory, that if it applied to the mind, that was simply the end product of an ascending sequence of unguided processes, then how could you possibly trust it? This is now being developed by philosophers, not only on the Christian side. Thomas Nagel, very distinguished American philosopher, has written a book that came out 2 weeks ago called Mind and Cosmos, where he repeats this argument. Alvin Plantinga similarly, who's a Christian philosopher of world distinction. But the argument is simply this, that if the mind is the brain, is the end product of mindless, unguided processes, then you remove any grounds for trusting anything it produces, including the idea that it's the end product of mindless, unguided process. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, I want to close on this note, that atheism, to me, the major objection is it undermines the very rationality that I need to do science. Whereas, of course, as I pointed out, Christianity supports it. My final point is simply this. We started with the two worldviews, let's end with them. The one starts with mass energy, the particles, if you like, the void. And that everything is explained in terms of the particles in the void, up to mind and the idea of God, because of course God doesn't exist. So you start with mass energy and you end up with mind and the idea of God. The other worldview goes like this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. All things came to be through Him. And without Him nothing came to be that came to be. You see the difference? The materialistic stroke naturalistic worldview begins with mass energy and ends up with mind. So mind is derivative. The worldview that I hold begins with the word intelligibility, God, who is mind, so that mass energy are derivative. It's the exact polar opposite. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it's that worldview that makes sense to me of both my science and the bigger questions that my science raises. Thank you very much indeed.